Hello, convention delegates and guests. Uh, I'd like to present now the Dyson Treasurers Report for 2021. My first one as a new tenure, kind of short notice. I started in November and now we're ready to go for this March convention. The agenda for the presentation is I'll start out with the year-end 2020 report. Then I'll go on to the 2021 budget, the 2022 preliminary budget, and we'll finish up with some highlights from the 2020 and 2021 March submission report. For 2020, the revenue summary for 2020 year end is on the screen now. The key points about this revenue report is in August of 2020, the Finance and Budget Committee revised the budget for 2020 based on the COVID-19 pandemic, and the numbers were revised and presented at the November convention. So we'll be working off of the budget presented and approved at the November 2020 convention. The first line and the first thing I'd like to highlight is the March submission giving, which is the pledges and income from our congregations. At the revised budget, we had a revised budget of $2,807,000. Our actual end of year is projected to be $2,919,350, which actually is a little bit more than we projected, about $112,000 more than projected. So I'd like to thank all the congregations within the diocese for doing their part and maintaining their pledged income to the diocese and making those contributions in a timely manner throughout the year. We far exceeded what we anticipated in August in the middle of the pandemic, and we're very close to what we're projecting beginning of 2020. The other area of our income, most other ones are pretty close to projections. The other area I'd like to point out in the income side is the last line, line 7, which is highlighted, the Ppp Grant. This was the loan we received as part of the CARES Act legislation in 2020, where the diocese applied for and received a loan of $370,000. We did receive that loan in 2020, and we actually have allowable expenses incurred in 2020, so that we hope to have forgiveness of the loan. However, at the end of 2020, December 31st, the loan was not officially forgiven by the Small Business Association. Therefore, it is carried on our books as a liability, a loan, in 2020, and not recorded as actual income. So you'll see a variance of $370,000, which is a carryover, will carry over into 2021 when the loan will actually be forgiven. But in 2020, we're not allowed, due to accounting reasons, to report it as income in 2020. At the end of 2020, our actual income is $3,855,000 versus a budget that was $4,164,000. So we had a slight underage in revenue in 2020 based on our revised budget of $308,000. But as you'll see later, we also were able to achieve some savings in our expenses so that we weren't in too bad a shape at the end of 2020. Starting with our 2020 outlays, I'll go through some of the highlights in the various mission areas on our 2020 outlays. At the beginning, in lines 10 and 20, those are our actual numbers for mission congregations, which was set in the budget of $402,000, and also our asking and pledge to the National Church of $565,000. Those amounts were paid out actually as were budgeted. The real variances that came through in our diocesan priorities area of the budget were in a few areas of our migrant ministry, anti-racism, and Hispanic commission. We had some slight underruns in that area. Most of those underruns were due to the fact that we did not have in-person opportunities to do in-person activities throughout much of 2020. So where we had budgeted quite a bit more in those areas, we spent about half of it in the areas of anti-racism and Hispanic commission. Overall, in diocesan priorities, we were within $11,000 of our projected budget, and a budget which was over $1 million. So we were basically within 1% of the projected budget in 2020. Going on to the next outlay area is congregational development. The key thing to note in congregational development, there was significant change in our mid-year budget rebudgeting based on the COVID-19 pandemic. You'll see in line 10103A, there was a new budget item line of $200,000 titled Parish COVID-19 Responses. This was put in the budget because we anticipated quite a bit of a need at our congregations to support all the changes due to the pandemic. At the point of mid to late summer, many congregations were reporting that they were losing income based on the lack of rent, also not the ability not to have most of their fundraising activities during 2020. And then there was a complete change in shifting the way giving was done. Since there were no in-person services, many of our congregations had to switch to a virtual giving model to keep up their pledges through their congregations. So it was quite a bit of uncertainty at that time, and the diocese anticipated that there would be a significant amount of support required by those congregations. It turned out that the actual outlays in 2020 were only $74,377, significantly less than the $200,000 we had budgeted. Again, that's attributed to the great agility and hard work at our congregations to adapt quickly to the pandemic, where we did not have as big a crisis as was anticipated. And many of those congregations also were able to receive PPP loans, which we believe help support some of the financial crisis, mitigate some of the financial impacts of that year. Another area that there was an underrun is Christian formation. Again, because of the lack of in-person capabilities, beginning of the year we had planned more in-person activities, and because everything had to go to virtual, there was an underrun of about $2,600, a little more than half of what was budgeted in 2020. That was the actual outlay. So overall, in our mission congregational development, we were only $132,000 less than what was budgeted. And a large portion of that $132,000 was related to not having to spend that $200,000 in COVID-19 response. Our next area of outlays is ministry development. Here we'll talk about the underruns in this area that are highlighted in yellow. In our committee on the priesthood, we have an underrun of about $6,800, largely due to the fact that most of the committee on the priesthood gatherings in 2020 occurred virtually as opposed to in person. And the clergy development and clergy days also all were done virtually throughout most of the year. So we had some slight underruns in terms of ministry development based on priest. In the deacon area, we had some underruns, slightly of about $2,700 on the committee on the deaconate. That was again due to the fact that their activities switched to virtual gatherings, and we had fewer deacons in the process in 2020. Other than that, we weren't too far underruns in those areas. The major area we had underruns in this area was Dyson Ministries related to youth activities and young adult ministries. We had budgeted $15,000 in 2020 in anticipation of new initiatives in terms of youth activities, primarily at the convocation level. Due to the pandemic, there were fewer convocation gatherings, and those gatherings were not in person, but actually had to turn to a completely virtual platform. We did have some activities in there, but we had an underrun of $10,000 in terms of youth activities in 2020. And similarly, young adult ministries, we did not have any outlays in 2020 for young adult ministries. Therefore, we had an underrun of $1,200 in that area. And the final area under Dyson Ministries where we had an underrun was the social justice block grants of $2,000. We weren't able to initiate those block grants in 2020, but we will pick that back up in 2021. So in the area of Dyson Ministries, this is an area where we had a fairly significant underrun of $13,000 in that area. And again, as I mentioned, mainly because of the transition from physical to virtual gatherings, that's why the underruns. The next subcategory in outlays is in Dyson Gatherings. And the main difference here is in the convention gathering. Although we went to a virtual convention, you'll see we had a slight overrun in that area. That's primarily due to the fact that when the convention was canceled in March of 2020, the diocese had commitments to a hotel for the convention being held in person. And even though we were able to get some savings in that, we did have committed to outlays that were guaranteed in the contract due to the change due to having to cancel the in-person convention. We did have a virtual convention in November, and the costs were fairly well managed in that area. So we have a slight overrun in diocese convention of $3,066, and mainly that's due to the commitments we had to make to the hotel, and not because we had any major overruns in our virtual convention. The other area that in terms of the next area we'll go to is programs and covenants. The major underrun in this area in program and covenants was in our companion diocese in Ecuador. Due to the pandemic, the ability to travel, which typically takes place in the summer months, was curtailed, and we had very few expenses in that area. Also, travel restrictions and COVID-19 restrictions in country restricted some of the activities that could be done even in a virtual mode down in that area. So we had an underrun of $10,000 in our companion diocese ministries in 2020. And that accounts for a significant amount of the total underrun in programs and covenants. Moving on to an overview of our outlays for 2020. The next area of outlays are in diocesan staff. Primarily in this area, everything was normal. Most of the expenses were normal in this area except for travel. And you'll see in each of these areas that our travel allowances, we were underrun in that area. That's because of the inability of diocesan staff to travel among the diocese, and the fact that most parishes was closed throughout much of 2020. We did have some minor travel, but not nearly as much as what was anticipated that we normally have during the year. The one exception is in the canon for Hispanic ministry. We budgeted $2,500 initially for travel, but that was a great underrun in the budget. The budget should have been close to $10,000 for 2020, and mainly because of the contract for our canon for Hispanic ministries. That does require quite a bit of travel throughout the Hispanic ministries throughout the diocese. And even in the pandemic conditions, he was able to do some travel to meet with those congregations where possible in a socially distanced manner. Therefore, there was an overrun of about $6,600 based on what was budgeted in there. And that was primarily, as I mentioned, due to the fact that it was under budgeted at the beginning of 2020. And the other areas around diocesan staff expenses, as noted, are all underruns were basically due to the travel. I moved down to the area of administrative staff expenses around health and dental insurance. There are some underruns in there. It's primarily due to there was a plan initially in 2020 to hire a new staff person. After some discussion, determined that one of our part-time staff people would move into full-time as opposed to bring on a new person half-time. This resulted in savings of some health benefits to the tune of $23,000 during 2020. So that accounts for most of that savings in that area. Slight savings in the staff cost overall, but because we did not bring a new person on, we achieved some savings in our healthcare in terms of health, dental, life insurance, and our long-term disability. The other area in terms of outlays, the next area is Diocesan Obligations. The main difference here in this area, because mid-year budgeting did reflect changes to the fact that we were going virtually, so we're fairly close to a lot of those budget items in there. One main area that I'd like to call your attention to is the property maintenance area. There was a variance in that area, a slight variance, but initially we had thought we were going to have a much larger variance in that area, but most of those expenses have been moved to COVID-19 responses. So we're able to keep the variance in property maintenance down to a manageable number in 2020. At the end of 2020, our net expenditures were outlays were $3,852,549. which is very close to, as I mentioned above, what our actual revenue was. So we only had a difference of $2,857 between our revenue and our outlays. Even though it was a challenging year to keep track of all the changes in expenses and revenue due to the pandemic, thanks to the diocesan staff and my prior finance and budget committee chair, we were able to keep a balanced budget going without any major shifts in our outlays in those areas. So at this point, I'd like to present the end of the 2020 outlays. Okay, that concludes, as I mentioned, that concludes our budget report for 2020, the actuals against the budget. If there are questions, please hold those questions until the end of all the financial presentations, and then we'll take questions on all of the reports that have been presented under the financial section. Moving on now to 2021 and 2022 budget areas. On the screen now, I'm showing our actual budget, our approved budget, our actuals for 2020, and the 2021 budget that we're proposing, and our preliminary 2022 budget all on one screen. As before, let me highlight the major areas of this report. The March of Mission Giving Pledge income, we're projecting $2,900,000 in 2021, which is almost exactly what we received in 2020. Again, thanks again to all the hard work that the parishes and congregations have done, and they've pledged up to now. The pledges have come in at about that $2,900,000. So we think we're very confident that we can achieve that amount we received in 2020, even though churches are still challenged with pandemic conditions. That we're very confident we can achieve that $2,900,000 in 2021. In 2022, you'll see we're projecting a slight increase to $3,100,000, which was the original amount we had planned at the beginning of 2020. The trust income and designated funds section of our budget, those are dividends actually from our Diocesan Investment Trust. We're budgeting dividends in 2021 and 2022 based on performance of those trust funds, and there are modest increases over what was the actuals in 2020. Line 6 is the trustee grant program. This is basically where we draw money down over previous years to basically fill in the deficits we have between our other income and what's needed to cover our outlays. Due to two factors in 2021, we believe that we can reduce our drawdowns from our Dyson Investment Trust to $231,000 versus the $298,000 in 2020, mainly because of carryover of some of the funds, as I mentioned earlier, from the Ppp Grant that we received in 2020, but we don't anticipate being forgiven into 2021. Therefore, we'll we'll record that income of $370,000 in 2021. That income will allow us to reduce the amount of draw we need from our Dyson Investment Trust in 2022, and we're able to refund our programs, as you'll see in the outlays, back up to the levels that we anticipated early on in 2020. We were able to refund them back up to those levels in 2021. And I'll just, in this area, I'll just highlight those areas where there are changes and major changes in each of the subtotals. In terms of Diocesan priorities, the difference between 2020 and 2021 are very major insignificant. We have a slight increase in there, but they're primarily due to increases in mission priority in our priorities for missions, going from 402,000 to 425,000. And all of the other ones in terms of Diocesan priorities are pretty much the same. The main area where I'll concentrate on in this presentation, where there's a significant change between 2020 and 2021, is in the area of lines 103A, Parish COVID-19 responses. As I mentioned, we had budgeted $200,000 in 2020, and we only had outlays of $74,000 actual in 2020. In 2022, while we don't think the pandemic is completely subsided, we do think the need for providing emergency funding to our congregations is greatly reduced, mainly because of the the performance we saw in 2020. We've left in a small amount of $22,000 in 2021 to cover any COVID-19 parish responses based to emergencies. Parishes are not fully open yet, and we don't project them to be fully open until the spring or mid 2021. So we've allowed some funds available in the budget to cover any extraordinary expenses that might be needed by our congregations. The other change in 2021 is we're bringing the Christian formation budget back up to $5,000, even though there was a significant underrun of about $2,000 in 2020. We believe that as things tend to normalize a little bit in 2021, we'll be back up to that level. So Christian formation expenses will be back up to the $5,000 amount that was projected. Going down to the next area is ministry development. We think the Committee on the Priesthood and the Deacon School of Ministry for Deacons, that overall we'll get back up to levels that we anticipated early in 2020. Committee on the Priesthood and other ministry development areas for priesthood are fairly close to what we projected at the beginning of 2020, and they're now in 2021 back at those levels. So those underruns we saw in 2021, we believe if we return to in-person gatherings, that we'll be able to spend the funds that were projected and have full activities in 2021. In terms of the Deacon School of Ministries, there's a change there. You'll see we're going from $10,000 in 2020 to $20,000 in 2021, and we reduced the Committee on the Deaconate and the Committee on the Deaconate budget to $5,900. Between the two, we're fairly close to what we were in 2020. The 2020 budget, we've just reallocated where the expenses are done. The School of Ministry is taking up a lot of the cost for cost instructions, and the Committee on the Deaconate is primarily handling background check expenses in those areas. So that's why there's a shift in the way the money is allocated under the deacons' ministry support. But overall, we're very close to what we've been doing traditionally. In the end, for ministry development, we're seeing a slight increase of about $14,000 from our budget in 2020 to budget in 2021. Most of that is based on the fact that the Committee on the Priesthood and the Committee on the Deaconate will be back up to in-person capabilities in 2021. Therefore, we have a budget that reflects the need to revert to more in-person capabilities. Also, the Deaconate class, because it's changed the process in terms of how they bring candidates in, we're anticipating a little more higher expenditure on higher number of Deaconate candidates in 2021. The next area that we'll discuss is our Diocesan Ministries. As I mentioned in 2020, we had originally planned on a new initiative in youth activities and youth ministries in 2020. We weren't able to do that, but in 2021, now that we have our youth ministry fully staffed and fully funded in there and people on board, we anticipate in 2021 to be able to have a much more expanded youth ministries program. Whether it's in person or virtually, we've learned a lot. Therefore, we budgeted that to be $29,000 in 2021 versus the $15,000 we budgeted in 2020. And the young adult ministries, we hope that we can spend that $1,200 that was budgeted in 2020 again in 2020. So those lines have been brought back up to where they were prior to the pandemic. A new line item in terms of community initiatives is line 313, the Task Force on Reconciliation and Reparations. You'll see a budget line item of $25,000 in that area. This is as a result of resolutions at the 2020 convention in November, which called for the formation of a task force on reconciliation and reparations. Task force members have gathered and put forth a budget of $25,000 for the initial startup costs in this area. So we're anticipating we have put in a budget line item of $25,000 for that. And line 315, social justice block grants, we budgeted that at $6,000 to support various block grants across the diocese for social justice initiatives. Again, in 2021, we hope to be able to do much more in that area, given that we're able to do much more in-person gatherings, or at least learn a lot in our virtual gatherings, so we can have full programs in those areas in 2021. Overall, our Dyson Gatherings, you'll see a significant increase from $18,200 in budgeted in 2020 to $61,200 budget in 2021. And a main portion of that is a $25,000 budget line item for Task Force on Reconciliation Reparations, and the $29,000 number for youth activities. Going down to the next area is Dyson Gatherings. The only significant change in this area is the money's budgeted for the convention. We now know we're having a virtual convention this year, which we're here this weekend for, and we didn't have any outlays or commitments to any of our hotels or physical locations. So based on the learnings from the November virtual convention, we budgeted $11,000 for convention in 2021. $11,000 is budgeted for that. You'll see, just a note, in 2022's preliminary budget, we've actually budgeted $33,000. This is anticipation of going back up to an in-person convention in 2022. That's why there's a big difference from 2021 to 2022. Going down to our next area to highlight is our companion diocese. Again, in 2021, we don't anticipate until the latter part of the year being able to go back to travel and in-person activities with our companion diocese. So where we normally have a budget of $12,500, the committee we budgeted about half of that for 2021, with the anticipation that the latter half of the year we can pick up our activities with our companion diocese, and the effects of the pandemic will have subsided substantially. In the other areas of the 2021 budget, I'll just go through the summary. And programs and covenants, we're fairly close to what was our actuals in 2020, what we budgeted in 2021. 12,000 actual versus 16,250 in the budget line item. This basically covers some of the carry forth of expenses from 2020 into 2021. So we don't see any significant changes in budget line items there. And Dyson staff, there was no increase in staff salaries in 2021, but we did budget in significant increases in outlays in terms of travel. Those travel budget line items were brought back up to close where they were in 2020. So the savings we had in 2020 with less travel, we're anticipating that towards the latter half of the year, Dyson staff will be able to return to a more normal travel schedule. Our Diocesan obligations, again, are fairly close between the 2020 budget and the 2021 budget. They're very close to those levels in that area. So we don't anticipate any significant changes, budget line items in those particular areas. The detail is on the website if you have any questions on that. But as going through, I didn't see any major significant changes to highlight in our 2021 budget discussion. So for 2021, our projected outlays are $4,129,962, which exactly meets what was our projected revenue for 2020. The real difference, if I go back to the beginning of our revenue area, as I talk about the 2022 budget, the real change that we'll see between 2021 and 2022 is a projected drawdown from our Dyson Investment Trust. We had the gift of having a carryover of $370,000 in 2021. That won't happen in 2022. So unfortunately, we're projecting an increase back up to nearly $400,000 from a drawdown from the Dyson Investment Trust in 2022. So that's the significant change, I believe, in our 2022 budgets. No significant change in our outlays, but a change in what makes up our revenue components in 2022 versus 2021. But going back all the way down to our final slide in 2022, which is a summary of our Diocese 2021 and 2022 budget all on one page. What I present and our Budget and Finance Committee presents to the convention for approval is our 2021 budget of $4,129,961 for revenue and outlays, and a preliminary budget of 2022 of $4,124,753 for budget and outlays, for revenue and outlays in 2022. I'd like to present this, make a motion to the convention that they accept these preliminary, the budget for 2021 and the preliminary budget for 2022.